In the quiet early hours of May 17, 2032, something strange appeared in the sky. At first, people thought it was just another shooting star. Across cities, night shift workers, truck drivers, and skywatchers noticed a bright light cutting through the darkness. But this was not a normal light. It was too big, too steady, and it did not fade away. It moved with purpose, slowing down as if it had control. In control rooms across the world, radar systems began to scream with alerts. Military screens from Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to New Delhi, showed the same object entering Earth's atmosphere. It wasn't breaking apart like a meteor should. It wasn't falling, it was arriving at the European Space Observatory. Dr. Lena Hart sat in front of a monitor, eyes fixed on the data coming in. She had spent her life studying space signals, hoping for contact someday. When she saw the readings, her heart started to race. The object was not a rock, not debris, not anything they had seen before. It was moving intelligently, changing direction in ways that natural objects could not. "It's slowing down," she whispered. The room fell silent. She sent the data to the United Nations Space Council, and within minutes phones were ringing across the globe. Governments called emergency meetings. The news leaked quickly, spreading through social media and television. Something from space was here, and it was still coming closer. For the first time in human history, the whole planet looked up together. Some were excited, believing it was the day humanity would finally meet intelligent life. Others were terrified, imagining invasion and destruction. The world's biggest powers, America, China, Russia, saw the event through the lens of fear and pride. Who would talk to them first? Who would control the situation? In Washington, the president held a late-night meeting with generals and scientists. A question hung heavy in the room. Should they treat the arrival as peaceful or dangerous? The general in charge of defense spoke firmly. "We can't take chances, sir. If it's a threat, we need to be ready." Around the same time, in Moscow and Beijing, similar conversations were happening. Every nation wanted to appear strong. Every leader feared being the one caught unprepared. The object entered Earth's atmosphere but didn't crash. Instead, it stopped floating above the Pacific Ocean, between Hawaii and Japan. It hung there silently, like a giant dark moon, miles above the water. Naval ships began to surround it from all sides. The American Pacific Fleet moved in, joined by Chinese and Japanese ships. No one trusted the other, but none dared to move away. Reporters from all over the world flooded the area. Live news channels broadcasted every movement. People stayed glued to their screens. The object looked metallic and smooth, without visible engines or wings. At night, it shimmered faintly, reflecting the moonlight. Dr. Lena Hart, watching from Europe, sent repeated messages to the international scientific team. "We must try to communicate before anyone does something stupid." But her words were ignored. Military channels were already in control. In the following hours, the world stood on edge. Fighter jets circled above. Missiles were armed but not yet launched. The U.S. Navy gave it a code name Echo 1. The United Nations called for calm, but no one truly listened. Every nation's leader wanted to protect their people first. In the middle of the Pacific, on board the USS Franklin, Colonel Marcus Dean stood on the deck, staring through binoculars at the distant dark shape. He had been a soldier for 12 years, fought in 2 wars, and seen every kind of human conflict. But this was different. He felt small. "If they're watching us," he said quietly to his second-in-command, "what do you think they see?" "Probably a bunch of scared apes holding guns," the younger officer replied, half joking, half serious. Colonel Dean didn't laugh. Deep down, he knew that was the truth. Hours turned into days. The object stayed in place, motionless, silent, as if it was waiting for something or testing humanity's patience. Scientists sent radio signals, sound, patterns, even coded mathematical messages into the sky, hoping for a response. But there was nothing. No signal came back. No light flickered. Just the heavy silence of something far beyond human understanding. Meanwhile, politicians grew restless. The public was demanding answers. Protests began in cities around the world, some people asking for peace and unity, others calling for the object to be destroyed before it was too late. Fear was spreading faster than truth. Dr. Hart felt torn between hope and dread. She had dreamed of this moment her entire life, the day when another intelligent species would finally make contact. But now, seeing how humans reacted, she felt ashamed. "We were supposed to welcome them," she told her assistant. "But look at us, we're preparing for war." Her assistant looked at her sadly. "Maybe they already know that about us," he said. On the third day, an emergency meeting was held between major world powers. Everyone agreed on one thing. The object hadn't attacked, but they couldn't assume it was safe. The American president signed an order called Protocol Shield, authorizing defensive positions but not a strike unless the object made hostile movement. Other countries quickly followed with similar plans. Colonel Dean received the new orders: keep his fleet ready, weapons loaded, safety off. His stomach twisted as he read the document. He knew how close human fear could push the world into disaster. That night, he stood alone on the deck again, the ocean calm beneath him. The alien object glowed faintly in the distance, a giant shadow against the stars. He wondered what kind of beings were inside, if they even had faces, or hearts, or emotions, like humans did. He wondered if they were afraid. To dot in the world below, people prayed, argued, cried, and hoped. News channels played dramatic music. Scientists gave interviews, and conspiracy theorists flooded the internet. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had an answer. By the end of the third day, one thing had become clear. This was not just a meeting between humans and something alien. It was a mirror held up to all of humanity. It showed how divided, frightened, and proud the world still was. Dr. Hart watched the skies from her observatory, unable to sleep. She imagined what the visitors might be thinking. Maybe they had sent signals for years, and Earth never noticed. Maybe they had been watching since humans first learned to fly, waiting to see if the species was ready. And maybe now, as the military surrounded them with weapons, they had their answer. The longer the object stayed silent, the louder humanity's noise became. Governments hid secrets, armies prepared for battle. And somewhere in the silence above the Pacific, the visitors simply watched. Dr. Hart took one last note before leaving her post that night. She wrote, "The first contact has begun, but not with words, not with light. It has begun with fear." No one knew it yet, but those quiet days of tension were the calm before something far greater. The world stood on the edge of history, hearts pounding, waiting for the sky to speak. And when it finally would, Earth would realize that they had been the ones who spoke first, just not with peace, but with suspicion and guns. The strange object still floated over the Pacific Ocean. It had been 3 long days since it arrived, and not once had it made a sound or moved in a threatening way. It was just there, steady and silent, like a huge black mountain hanging in the sky. But for the people on Earth, that silence was not comforting, it was terrifying. The unknown always scared humans, and this time the unknown was watching them from above. In a military base somewhere in Nebraska, Colonel Marcus Dean sat inside a dimly lit command room. The walls were covered with screens showing satellite images, radar signals, and live camera feeds from naval ships circling the alien craft. Every few minutes, someone would report an update. No movement detected, energy levels stable, visuals unchanged. The same words repeated again and again. But the silence only made the tension worse. Outside, soldiers moved like shadows, checking weapons, fueling jets, loading missiles. Every man and woman on duty knew one mistake could start something they couldn't stop, but orders were orders. They were to stay alert and be ready for anything. Colonel Dean looked tired. He hadn't slept properly since the object appeared. He ran a hand over his face and said quietly to his communications officer, "They're not attacking us, but we're acting like we're already at war." The young officer gave a nervous smile. "Sir, it's better to be ready than sorry." Dean didn't answer. Deep down, he knew the truth: human beings were preparing for war, not because they were attacked, but because they were afraid. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Geneva, Dr. Lena Hart sat in a large conference room full of scientists, translators, and diplomats. She was part of the United Nations research group assigned to study the event. The group had been trying to find a way to talk to the visitors, but so far, nothing worked. They had sent thousands of radio signals, sound patterns, even light messages, using mathematical codes, but there had been no reply. It's possible they don't use communication in the way we understand, Dr. Hart said. They might not hear sound, or they might communicate using something we don't even know exists yet. But her words were drowned out by the louder voices in the room: military advisors and government officials. "We can't sit and wait forever," one of them argued. "What if they're gathering information? What if they're preparing to attack? We have to show strength." Dr. Hart slammed her notebook shut. "Show strength? You mean show guns?" she said sharply. "If they wanted to attack, we wouldn't even be having this conversation right now. Maybe they're waiting to see how we behave." The room went silent for a moment, but no one changed their mind. Fear had already taken over reason. Around the world, the story of the alien craft had become the biggest event in human history. News anchors spoke nonstop, experts argued on TV, and conspiracy theories spread faster than truth. Some believed it was a government experiment gone wrong. Others claimed it was God's final test. Religious groups gathered to pray, believing the end of days had come. Technology companies tried to decode strange electromagnetic signals that seemed to pulse from the object. People around the world stayed awake all night, staring at the sky, wondering if the next day would be humanity's last. In the Pacific, the situation grew even more dangerous. Warships from different countries surrounded the object. The sea was crowded with vessels carrying missiles, jets, and soldiers. No one trusted the other side. The United States, China, Russia, and Japan all wanted to be the first to make contact, but also the first to defend themselves if things went wrong. Colonel Dean walked through the control room of the USS Franklin, his boots echoing on the metal floor. He passed rows of screens showing live feeds of the object. On one screen, he saw the smooth metallic surface glimmer faintly under the sun. It had no windows, no openings, and no sign of life. It looked like a perfect piece of dark glass. "Sir," said a radar operator, "the object has shifted slightly, about 2 meters east." Dean's heart skipped a beat. Keep tracking, he said quickly. The entire room went silent. Soldiers watched their monitors closely, hands hovering over switches, but after a few minutes, the object stopped moving again. It wasn't an attack, just a small drift, maybe caused by the atmosphere. Still, Dean could feel the fear growing among the crew. He could see it in their eyes. The waiting was the hardest part. Back in Europe, Dr. Hart was growing frustrated. Every message she sent to the global task force came back with the same response. Military protocol takes priority. Scientists were being pushed aside while politicians and generals took control. That evening, she stood outside the observatory, looking up at the faint light in the distant sky. If they're watching us, she whispered, they must think we're children playing with fire. Her assistant, Tomas, joined her. Maybe that's what they came to see, he said softly. How we react. In America, the president met again with top advisors. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. We cannot appear weak, one general said. If they attack, we need to hit back hard. Another advisor disagreed. Sir, there's been no aggression. We should wait. The president rubbed his temples. The pressure from the world was enormous. Every news channel demanded a decision. Every country demanded answers. Finally, he sighed and said, prepare for defensive action, but do not engage unless they move toward us. I repeat, no first strike. The order was sent out to all fleets and bases. The code name was Standby Orders. Colonel Dean received it that night. He read the message on his tablet and felt a cold wave run through him. Maintain readiness. Assume hostility until proven otherwise. He hated those words. Assume hostility. It meant they were preparing for war, even though nothing had happened. He walked out onto the deck again, staring at the alien craft hanging in the night sky. The stars shone around it, but it didn't reflect amid absorbed light, like it was made of darkness itself. Sir, said a young soldier beside him, do you think they know we're ready to fight? Dean nodded slowly. If they're intelligent, they know everything we're doing, and if they came all this way, they already understand what kind of species we are. The soldier looked nervous. Do you think they're afraid of us? Dean gave a sad smile. No, I think they're disappointed. Back on land, fear was changing people. Panic buying began in cities. Families stocked up on food and water. Some people moved underground or into the mountains, fearing a coming war. Others threw parties, saying they wanted to celebrate humanity's last days. Social media was full of videos claiming aliens were already walking among them. Through all this noise, one thing was clear: humans didn't know how to handle peace when faced with the unknown. Instead of curiosity, they chose fear. In Japan, scientists detected strange energy patterns coming from the object's soft pulses, like waves, but they didn't match any known form of communication. When Dr. Hart received the data, she grew excited. It's a signal, she said. Maybe they're trying to talk, but not in our way. Before she could send her analysis to the UN team, she got a call from the Defense Council. Dr. Hart, all communication attempts are suspended. The situation is now under full military control. She froze. You're stopping science for politics. Until further notice, the voice said. Then the line went dead. She sank into a chair, staring at the data on her screen. They'll ruin everything, she whispered. We're going to start a war because we're too scared to listen. That night, in the middle of the dark Pacific, the water was calm and the air was still. The alien craft floated above, silently unmoving. The human ships around it were glowing with lights, full of noise and life engines, radios, human voices shouting orders. The difference between the two could not have been greater. Inside the alien ship, no one knew what was happening, but to the humans below, it felt like a staring contest between two worlds. Colonel Dean watched the horizon until dawn. He thought about his wife and daughter back home, wondering what he would tell them if this turned into war. He didn't believe the visitors wanted to harm anyone, but he also knew that one wrong signal, one radar error, or one panicked commander could unleash chaos. As the sun rose, he whispered to himself, we're standing at the edge of history, and we're pointing guns at it. The next day, Dr. Hart sent one final message to every international channel she could access. Her message was short. If we attack them first, we may never get another chance to speak again. She didn't know if anyone read it. The world continued to wait. Jets circled in the sky. Missiles stood ready. Soldiers didn't sleep, and the whole planet held its breath. 3 days of silence had turned into 3 days of fear. Earth didn't know what was coming next, but it was clear that when it did, the first shot might not come from the sky. It might come from below. It was the 4th night since the strange object had arrived. The world was still holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sky over the Pacific was clear, and the ocean below was calm. But inside every military base and ship, the tension felt like a storm. No one slept properly. No one smiled. Even laughter had disappeared from the decks. The silence from the alien ship was unbearable. It hung there in the sky, a silent judge watching humanity's every move. Colonel Marcus Dean stood on the bridge of the USS Franklin, his uniform wrinkled and his eyes red from lack of sleep. The ship was quiet except for the low hum of the engines. On the main screen, the alien craft floated like a mountain of darkness against the stars. Dean's second-in-command, Lieutenant Harper, checked his radar and said softly, Still no movement, sir. It's like they're waiting for us to do something. Dean nodded. That's what scares me. Far away, in command centers across the world, the same scene was playing out. Scientists monitored data, soldiers stood ready, and leaders argued in secret rooms. The standby orders were still active. Everyone was to hold their fire unless the object made a hostile move. But the longer it stayed still, the more unstable humans became. On the mainland, the world's population had reached its emotional limit. News channels ran 24-hour coverage, showing pictures of the dark object and ships below it. Some called it the Silent War. People in cities prayed in the streets. Schools were closed. Stock markets crashed. Planes were grounded. Humanity had paused, frozen by the weight of the unknown. In Geneva, Dr. Lena Hart sat in her lab surrounded by tired scientists. She had barely slept, her hair messy and her eyes heavy. Yet she refused to stop watching the data coming from satellites. She noticed something: tiny electrical pulses coming from the alien ship every few hours. They weren't random. They had rhythm. It's like a heartbeat, she whispered. They're alive in there. She tried sending a message again, even though military orders had forbidden any non-approved signals. We come in peace. She transmitted in multiple languages and frequencies. But there was no reply. Only silence. Then came the storm. Late that night, as the ships continued their watch, dark clouds began to roll in from the west. Rain poured heavily, and thunder roared across the ocean. The waves grew rough, slamming against the ships. Radar systems began to flicker and glitch due to the interference. The weather made communication difficult. Inside the USS Franklin, Colonel Dean leaned over the radar operator's shoulder. The screen was filled with static lines and flashing signals. We're losing visuals, the operator said nervously. The storm's messing with everything. Keep scanning, Dean ordered. Stay focused. Suddenly, one of the radar screens beeped loudly. A small red dot appeared near the alien craft. Unidentified launch detected, the operator shouted. Dean froze. Where? Asterisk from the object, sir. It's moving toward us. In that instant, alarms blared through the ship. Soldiers jumped to positions. Missiles were armed. Other ships reported the same signal. Echo 1 has launched something, voices shouted through the radios. But the storm made it impossible to confirm. The radar signals were bouncing around from lightning and static. No one could see clearly. Within seconds, panic took control. A nearby destroyer, believing it was under attack, fired an anti-air missile toward the object. The explosion lit up the sky, a fiery streak cutting through the storm. Everyone on every ship watched as the missile sped toward the dark craft above. Colonel Dean shouted into his radio. Who fired? Who authorized that shot? But it was too late. The missile was already halfway there. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Scientists in Geneva, leaders in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing all watched the live feeds in horror. Humanity had just fired its first weapon at something not from Earth. The missile exploded near the alien craft in a burst of white light. For a second, the clouds glowed, and then everything went silent again. There was no damage visible, no reaction from the object, just eerie stillness. Dean's heart pounded. Did we hit it? Unknown, sir, said Harper. No movement. Wait, sir. I'm detecting an energy surge. A low hum began to fill the air. The sea around the ships started to ripple unnaturally. Instruments on the control panels flickered. Radios crackled. Then, without warning, every electronic system on the USS Franklin shut down. The lights went out. The engines died. The radar screens turned black. Even the emergency systems failed. Across the ocean, the same thing happened to every ship, every jet, every satellite in orbit. In cities around the world, lights flickered and vanished. Power grids collapsed. Communication networks failed. Airplanes lost control and were forced to glide down for emergency landings. The world went dark in less than 60 seconds. An invisible wave of electromagnetic energy had swept through the planet, shutting down everything that ran on electricity. Colonel Dean stood in the dark bridge, hearing only the rain and his own heartbeat. What just happened? He asked in a whisper. Lieutenant Harper checked his equipment, which was completely dead. It's all gone, sir. They turned everything off. Outside, the alien craft glowed faintly, like a storm cloud lit from within. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't destroying. It had simply silenced humanity's machines. In Geneva, Dr. Hart's lab went dark as well. The computers shut off mid-process, and the screens went blank. The entire building buzzed with confusion. What happened? Someone shouted. Dr. Hart stared at the dead monitors. An electromagnetic pulse, she said softly. They just shut down our technology. All of it. Are we under attack? Another scientist asked. She shook her head slowly. No, if they wanted to kill us, we'd already be dead. Around the world, panic spread faster than any virus. Cities without power fell into chaos. People rushed into the streets, confused and frightened. Air traffic stopped. Hospitals went dark. The internet was gone. Humanity, the most technologically advanced species on Earth, had been thrown back into silence. Back on the USS Franklin, soldiers tried to start backup generators by hand, but nothing worked. Colonel Dean looked up at the sky, drenched in rain. The alien craft still floated above, untouched and quiet. "They're sending a message," he said finally. "What message, sir?" Dean's voice was calm but heavy. "That we fired first. And they don't want to kill us. They want to teach us." For the next few hours, the world remained dark. No one could communicate across continents. The night sky, usually filled with the glow of city lights, was now pitch black. It felt as if the planet itself had stopped breathing. Dr. Hart sat by the window of her lab holding a flashlight. She thought about everything she had studied, everything she believed. "They responded exactly as we feared," she said to Thomas. "We showed them our fear, and they showed us our weakness." Thomas looked out the window. "Do you think they'll come down now?" She shook her head. "I think they've already said what they needed to say." In the following hours, reports trickled in from ships and survivors. The EMP electromagnetic pulse had not killed anyone. It had only shut down machines. No explosions, no fires, no destruction. The alien craft had chosen to disable, not to harm. Colonel Dean gathered his crew on deck under the dim light of lanterns. The ocean was calm again. "They could have wiped us out," he said quietly. "But they didn't. Maybe that's their way of telling us we failed." The soldiers listened in silence, unsure how to feel. They were alive, but humiliated. Humanity had shown its worst instincts, and the visitors had responded with power beyond imagination, but without cruelty. On land, people began to adapt quickly. Farmers lit torches to guide others. Families sat together in darkness, telling stories by candlelight. For the first time in generations, the stars were visible to everyone again. In one small village, a little girl looked up at the night sky and asked her mother, "Why did the lights go away?" Her mother smiled sadly. "Maybe the stars wanted us to see them again." For 3 days, the earth remained mostly silent. Slowly, a few generators came back on. Engineers began to rebuild systems, but many technologies were permanently damaged. Governments tried to send messages, but communication was still weak. Dr. Hart finally received a partial signal from a military base in Europe. The message was simple: humanity fired first. They answered without violence. She sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window at the dark horizon. Then she whispered, "They gave us a chance to choose who we are, and we failed." Back on the USS Franklin, Colonel Dean watched the alien craft from the deck. Its glow had faded now, like a dying ember in the sky. He didn't know if it would leave or stay. But he knew one thing for certain: the first contact between Earth and another world had happened, and humanity had not come in peace. The visitors had seen everything. They had seen the fear, the pride, and the readiness to destroy, and yet they had spared everyone. They didn't come to conquer, they came to remind Earth of what it had become. As the storm clouds cleared and the stars shone once again, Colonel Dean whispered to himself, "They didn't attack us because they didn't need to. They already won." The morning after the blackout, the world felt like it had been reborn into silence. Cities that were once filled with the noise of cars, machines, and people were now quiet and dark. The hum of electricity that everyone had taken for granted was gone. The streets that had once been bright with neon lights and screens were now lit only by sunlight. People stepped outside their homes, confused and frightened, staring at the sky. The strange object still floated there, high above the Pacific Ocean, motionless as ever. It hadn't attacked, it hadn't spoken, but it had already changed everything. Colonel Marcus Dean stood on the deck of the USS Franklin, looking at the still water below. His ship, like every other, was dead. No power, no communication, no control. The alien craft hung silently above them, and for the first time in his life, Dean felt completely powerless. He had trained for war, not for silence. "They didn't kill us," he said to his second-in-command. "They just took away everything we depend on." "Sir," the younger man asked, "do you think they'll talk to us now?" Dean shook his head. "No, I think we already said everything they needed to hear." Across the world, scientists and engineers worked desperately to restore systems. Some managed to power small radios using old batteries or hand-cranked generators. Slowly, messages began to spread. The aliens had not attacked. There were no deaths, no destruction. Just a planet without power. Humanity had been spared but humbled. In Geneva, Dr. Lena Hart sat near a window in her dark laboratory. Her once busy computers and machines were useless now. She wrote notes by hand in a notebook, trying to make sense of what had happened. "It was a pulse," she explained to her assistant Thomas, who was sitting nearby. "Not a weapon, but a message. They showed us what happens when we lose the things we rely on the most." Thomas nodded. "Do you think they want us to live without technology?" Dr. Hart looked out the window at the faint outline of the alien craft in the distant sky. "No," she said softly. "They want us to remember that we can't use our power wisely if we don't control our fear." By evening, something new happened. From the alien ship, small glowing orbs began to descend toward Earth. They looked like floating spheres of light, smooth and silver, each one about the size of a car. They moved slowly, silently, gliding through clouds and spreading out across the planet. People watched them in awe and fear as they landed in cities, forests, deserts, and small towns all over the world. Colonel Dean watched one land near his ship. floating just above the ocean surface. It was beautiful and strange, glowing softly like moonlight on water. The soldiers aimed their rifles instinctively, but Dean raised his hand. "Stand down," he said quietly. "No more guns. Not this time." The orb began to shimmer, projecting a beam of light onto the deck. At first, the light was blinding. Then it began to show moving images, pictures that everyone could see. It showed the Earth from space, blue and peaceful. Then, the images changed. Wars, bombs, pollution, burning forests, starving children, and cities full of smoke. It was as if the visitors were holding up a mirror, showing humanity what they had done to their own planet. On the USS Franklin, everyone stood frozen, watching. Some soldiers lowered their weapons, ashamed. Others looked away, unable to face the truth. The images continued: oceans filled with plastic, animals dying, people fighting for power, destroying one another. Then the light faded, and only a single image remained: the Earth, dark and silent, just as it was now. "They're telling us something," Dean whispered. "They're saying we're the threat," Harper replied quietly. At the same time, in cities around the world, other orbs showed the same scenes. People fell to their knees, crying. Others tried to touch the light, whispering apologies into the air. In a small village in Africa, a group of children reached out toward one of the orbs, and it projected an image of trees growing tall and green. In Japan, an orb showed a city slowly healing from pollution. The message was the same everywhere. It wasn't punishment. It was a warning. Dr. Hart stood outside the United Nations building in Geneva, surrounded by hundreds of people staring at the glowing orb in front of them. The light reflected in her eyes as she whispered, "They didn't come to destroy us. They came to test us." Someone near her asked, "Test us for what?" "For understanding," she replied. "For peace." After a few hours, the orbs began to rise back into the sky, joining one another above the Earth. They formed a glowing ring around the planet, like a halo of light. Then, from every continent, people watched as the main ship slowly began to move for the first time in days. It rose higher, leaving the atmosphere behind, its massive shadow fading into the stars. It didn't vanish. Suddenly it ascended gracefully, as if giving humanity one last chance to look and understand. For a brief moment, the entire world stood still. There were no borders, no enemies, no wars, just one planet watching the same sky. Colonel Dean took off his cap and bowed his head. "They came here to see if we were ready," he said softly, "and we showed them we weren't." The power did not return for weeks. Planes couldn't fly. Cars couldn't move. The internet, phones, satellites, all were useless. Humanity was forced to live simply again. People lit fires, used candles, traded food, and helped their neighbors. For the first time in many years, strangers spoke to each other in the streets. Without screens or noise, people began to look up again to the stars, to one another. In that silence, the world began to change. Governments that had once hidden behind military power now faced angry and frightened citizens who demanded answers. When the lights finally began to flicker back on, it wasn't because of science, it was because people had started to work together again, sharing knowledge freely. Dr. Hart became one of the leading voices of the new age. When communication returned, she gave a speech broadcast to the world using restored satellite signals. Her words were simple but powerful. "We fired first," she said. "We greeted peace with fear, but we have been given a second chance. The visitors did not destroy us, they reminded us of who we are." Her message spread across the globe, translated into every language. People began calling the event the Great Silence. It became a symbol of humility. Religious leaders called it divine judgment. Scientists called it proof that intelligent life exists beyond Earth, but most people simply called it a warning from the stars. Colonel Dean, now retired, returned to his hometown after months at sea. He had been offered medals and honors, but he refused them all. "I don't deserve medals for surviving," he said. "We didn't survive because we were brave. We survived because they had mercy." One night, sitting in his backyard, Dean looked up at the stars. The sky was clearer than he'd ever seen it before. No pollution, no bright city lights, just millions of glowing points across the dark. For the first time in years, he felt peace. He thought about the moment the missile was fired, and how quickly everything changed. A single human error had nearly destroyed everything. Yet, the visitors had answered not with death, but with silence. That choice haunted him, but it also gave him hope. If beings from another world could show mercy, maybe humans could too. Dr. Hart visited him months later, traveling by ship since airplanes were still grounded. They sat together under the same sky, talking quietly. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Dean asked. "Yes," she said, "but not until we stop seeing everything as a threat. They'll return when we finally understand what they were trying to tell us." "And what was that?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "That we're not ready for the universe until we can live peacefully on our own planet." That night, the streak of light appeared in the sky, maybe a meteor, maybe something more. People across the world saw it and felt something deep inside their hearts. For the first time, the sight of light from the heavens didn't bring fear, it brought hope. Months passed, and the world continued to rebuild. Without advanced technology, people relied on community, on cooperation. The earth began to heal. Rivers ran cleaner. Skies cleared. Forests regrew. Humanity learned to slow down. At a remote school, a teacher told her students the story of the visitors. The children listened with wide eyes as she said, "They didn't come to talk. They came to show us what we'd forgotten." One child raised his hand. "Do you think they'll ever forgive us?" The teacher smiled. "They already did. That's why we're still here." In every corner of the world, people carried that lesson in their hearts. The Great Silence was no longer seen as a tragedy but as a gift, a moment when the stars themselves had asked humanity to change, and so, even though the alien ship was gone, its message remained. It wasn't written in words or carved in stone, it was written in the memory of every person who had looked up that night and realized that Earth, in all its beauty and chaos, had been given a second chance to become something better. Months had passed since the Great Silence. The world that once buzzed with endless noise, traffic, and technology had changed completely. Cities that were once filled with glowing lights now looked different, quieter, slower, but strangely more alive. People had learned to live without the constant hum of machines. Radios crackled again, but only in short bursts. Planes were still grounded, and most satellites in orbit were dead. Humanity had been forced to restart from almost nothing, and for the first time, it was doing so with humility. Colonel Marcus Dean sat on the porch of his small home in Virginia, looking at the sky that seemed bluer than he remembered. The air was cleaner now. The stars at night shone brighter than they had in decades. He had retired after the event, refusing any honor or recognition. The government wanted to call him a hero, but he didn't feel like one. "Heroes save people," he once told a reporter, "but we were the ones who almost destroyed everything. The real heroes were the ones who showed mercy." He spent most of his days in silence, growing vegetables in his backyard and fixing small things around the house. Sometimes, people from news agencies would come to interview him about that night, the night Earth fired first. He always told them the same thing. "They didn't come to attack us. They came to see what we would do. And we failed their test." In another part of the world, Dr. Lena Hart was still working tirelessly after the blackout. She had become one of the world's most trusted voices. Her research center in Geneva had turned into something new, a school where young scientists from every country came to study not just space, but humanity itself. She called it the Center for Cosmic Ethics. "If we ever meet them again," she would say, "we must be ready not with weapons, but with wisdom." Dr. Hart had aged since the first contact, but her passion burned brighter than ever. Every night, she went outside to look at the stars. She kept a small telescope, though much of her old technology was gone. Still, she searched, not for the ship, not for proof of aliens, but for a sign, a signal, a flicker, something that told her the visitors were still watching. The world around her was slowly healing. The air was cleaner, and the oceans had started to recover. Without heavy industries and constant pollution, Earth looked fresher, almost younger. Many people called it the Great Reset. Governments that had fallen during the chaos were replaced by smaller councils that focused on rebuilding communities rather than fighting for power. For the first time, nations began to work together without needing a treaty or threat. Food was shared across borders, doctors traveled freely, and knowledge became more valuable than money. It was as if the alien visitors had done in one act what thousands of peace talks had failed to do. They had forced humanity to cooperate by showing what it was like to lose everything. Colonel Dean received a letter from Dr. Hart one morning. It was handwritten. Something rare now. The letter said, "Marcus, I still believe they're out there watching. Maybe not to punish, but to see if we've learned. I hope someday we can look up and say we're ready." He smiled as he read it. He hadn't seen her since the day the ship vanished, but he often thought about her words back then. They didn't come to destroy us. They came to judge us. He wondered if, perhaps, their judgment had been kinder than humanity deserved. Dean decided to visit her. The journey took weeks since travel was slow. There were no airplanes, only trains powered by old engines and ships that moved across the oceans once more. When he finally reached Geneva, the city looked peaceful. The noise of cars and advertisements was gone. Instead, he heard laughter from children, saw bicycles on clean streets, and people talking face to face without screens between them. When he arrived at the center, Dr. Hart was standing in a garden, surrounded by her students. She looked older but full of energy. Her smile widened when she saw him. "Marcus," she said warmly. "You came." He nodded. "I needed to see what hope looks like again." They sat together under a tree, just like old friends, talking about everything that had changed. "Do you miss the old world?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I think we needed to lose it. We were too busy destroying ourselves. They didn't take away our technology, they took away our arrogance." Dean looked thoughtful. "Do you think they'll ever return?" "Yes," she said quietly, "but only when we're ready to talk, not to fight." That night, the two of them stayed up watching the stars. Around them, the world was dark and calm. Somewhere, a group of children were singing songs they had learned about the lights in the sky. It had become part of culture, now stories told to remind people of that day when Earth faced the unknown and survived. The stories had many names. Some called it the Judgment Day, others the Great Silence, but most people referred to it simply as the day the stars spoke. Every year, on the same date, people around the world would gather outside at night, light candles, and look at the sky together. No speeches, no fireworks, just silence and gratitude. In one of those gatherings, a young boy asked his grandfather, "Why didn't they talk to us?" The old man smiled and said, "Maybe they didn't use words because we wouldn't have listened. Maybe they showed us instead." And that became the truth everyone quietly accepted. Over time, the human race became different. The lessons stayed. Wars almost disappeared. Nations that had hated each other for centuries began to trade freely and share knowledge. Money lost much of its importance. Education, compassion, and respect became the new wealth. Dr. Hart published her final research paper titled First Contact, The Lesson of Silence. In it, she wrote, "They didn't come to invade us or save us. They came to reflect us. They showed us our face, and it frightened us into change. Perhaps that was their purpose all along." Her words spread across the world, translated into every language. Students memorized them. Philosophers debated them. Poets wrote songs about them. The phrase "they showed us our face" became a saying used whenever people made selfish choices or forgot the lessons of that day. Colonel Dean, after his visit, returned home once again. He started keeping a journal about everything that had happened, trying to preserve history for future generations. One night, while writing, he stopped and looked out his window. The stars shimmered quietly above him. Suddenly, one of them seemed to move not fast like a meteor, but slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging him. He stood up, went outside, and watched it until it vanished behind a cloud. He didn't tell anyone about it. He didn't need to. In his heart, he knew what it meant. They were still watching. Years passed, and the world continued to evolve. New forms of energy were discovered, ones that didn't harm the planet. Forests grew back where there had once been deserts. The oceans teemed with life again. It was as if Earth itself had begun to heal from centuries of human damage. On the anniversary of the Great Silence, Dr. Hart passed away peacefully in her sleep. People around the world mourned her as the woman who taught Earth how to listen. Her students continued her work, building observatories and communication systems that used natural signals instead of radio waves, hoping one day to send a message that didn't sound like noise but like understanding. Colonel Dean attended her memorial. Standing among thousands of people holding candles, he spoke only one sentence. "She taught us that the first contact was never between humans and aliens, it was between humans and truth." After her death, Dean lived quietly, spending his final years near the coast. On his last night, he sat outside, wrapped in a blanket, watching the ocean waves roll in under the stars. He whispered softly, "We're learning now. Maybe one day we'll be ready to listen." And far above him, in the endless dark, something shimmered. 3 small lights moving together before disappearing into the deep sky. Whether it was a ship or just another meteor, no one ever knew. But for those who believed it was a sin, a promise that the visitors had not abandoned Earth, only given it time to grow. The world that remained after them was wiser, calmer, and more united. Humanity had finally realized that power meant nothing without understanding, and technology meant nothing without empathy. The visitors had come armed, but not with weapons. Their weapon had been truth. Their silence had been the loudest lesson humanity would ever hear. And though centuries would pass, and the story would fade into legend, one truth would always remain. The day the stars went quiet was the day humanity finally learned to listen.